She traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, but when her train finally stopped, no one was waiting for her. Abandoned, alone, and with nowhere to go, Clara thought her life was over. But that same night, a quiet cowboy with a broken heart offered her shelter on his lonely ranch. Neither of them knew that one ruthless man would soon threaten everything they had. And before the winter ended, Clara would have to choose between running away again, or standing beside the man who was ready to risk his life for her. A stranger at the station. The wind howled through the small wooden train station in the dusty town of Red Creek. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, where people knew each other's names, and where strangers were noticed the moment they arrived. That afternoon, the old steam train screeched to a stop, sending clouds of smoke into the pale sky. Only one passenger stepped off. A young woman. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She stepped carefully onto the wooden platform, clutching a small worn suitcase in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Her brown dress was plain but neat, and her dark hair was pinned carefully under a modest hat. Clara looked around nervously. This was supposed to be the beginning of her new life. A fresh start. According to the letters she had received for months, a rancher named Thomas Callahan had asked her to come west and become his wife. They had exchanged letters filled with promises of partnership, kindness, and a quiet life on the frontier. It was called a mail-order marriage, something many women did to escape poverty in the crowded cities back east. But as Clara scanned the platform, her hopeful smile slowly faded. No one was waiting for her. No man holding flowers. No wagon. No welcoming smile. Just the wind. The station master glanced at her curiously. "You expecting someone, miss?" he asked. Clara forced a polite smile. "Yes, my husband." The word husband felt strange on her lips since she had never actually met him. She unfolded the letter again. Thomas Callahan, Red Creek Ranch. The station master scratched his beard. "Well, Callahan Ranch is about 5 miles north of town." Clara swallowed nervously. "Would someone be able to take me there?" The man looked around. "There's a rancher heading that direction tonight. Might give you a ride." Clara nodded gratefully. But as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, hours passed, and no one came for her. Finally, a tall man stepped into the station. He looked rough and worn, with dusty boots, a weathered coat, and tired eyes that seemed to carry years of quiet pain. His name was Daniel Hayes. He noticed the young woman sitting alone on the bench, clutching her suitcase like it was the only thing she owned. "You waiting on someone?" he asked gently. Clara stood up quickly. "Yes, sir, I'm here to meet my husband." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Who's the lucky man?" "Thomas Callahan." The moment the name left her lips, Daniel's expression changed. Not anger, not surprise, something closer to pity. Clara noticed it immediately. "What is it?" she asked nervously. Daniel hesitated. Then he sighed. "Miss, Callahan left town 2 weeks ago." Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" "He sold his ranch, packed up, and rode south." The world seemed to stop. That can't be right," Clara whispered. Daniel looked at her suitcase, her thin coat, the hope fading from her eyes. "He never mentioned a wife." Clara's hands began to shake. For months she had written letters. She had trusted every word. She had traveled over 1,000 miles for this. And now, she had nowhere to go. The station master quietly stepped outside, giving them space. Clara sank back onto the bench, staring at the floor. "I don't understand," she murmured. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. He wasn't good with emotions. Or strangers. Especially not crying women. And Clara was dangerously close to tears. "Do you have family here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Money for a room." Another slow shake. Daniel sighed deeply. He knew he should walk away. His ranch was already struggling. Winter was coming. He barely had enough food for himself. Taking in a stranger was the last thing he needed. But something about Clara's quiet dignity stopped him. She hadn't begged. She hadn't panicked. She simply sat there, trying not to break. Finally Daniel spoke. "You can stay at my ranch tonight." Clara looked up in surprise. "I couldn't impose like that. It's just a spare room," he said quickly. "Nothing fancy." She hesitated. The truth was, she had no other option. "Thank you," she said softly. They stepped outside where Daniel's old wagon waited beside two tired horses. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour. The land stretched endlessly around them, golden fields, distant mountains, and the deep quiet of the frontier. Clara held her suitcase tightly as the wagon bumped along the dirt road. "Have you lived here long?" she asked politely. 10 years. "Do you like it?" Daniel shrugged. "It's quiet." But Clara noticed something in his voice. Loneliness. Eventually they reached a small wooden ranch house sitting alone under a wide open sky. Daniel helped her down from the wagon. "It's not much," he said. Clara looked around. The ranch was simple, worn, but peaceful. "It's perfect," she replied gently. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke. Daniel showed her a small spare room. "You can stay here." Clara placed her suitcase on the bed. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Daniel." She smiled faintly. "Clara." For a moment neither of them spoke. Two strangers. Both carrying quiet sadness. Both pretending they were stronger than they felt. That night, as Clara lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, she realized something strange. She had come west to marry one man. But fate had placed her in the home of another. And neither of them knew yet that their lives were about to change forever. Learning to survive. The first morning at Daniel Hayes' ranch was colder than Clara expected. The wind slipped through the cracks of the wooden walls, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant mountains. Clara slowly opened her eyes and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memories rushed back. The train ride, the empty station, the cruel truth about Thomas Callahan, and the quiet cowboy who had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. Clara sat up in the small bed and wrapped the thin blanket around her shoulders. Through the window she could see the sunrise stretching across the prairie. The sky glowed in soft shades of gold and orange. For a brief moment, it looked peaceful. But Clara knew peace could be deceiving. She stepped into the kitchen where Daniel was already awake, pouring coffee into a metal cup. He looked surprised to see her. "Most folks from the city sleep longer," he said. Clara gave a small smile. "I suppose I'm not most folks anymore." Daniel handed her a cup of coffee. It was strong and bitter, but warm. "Thank you," she said. They sat quietly at the wooden table. Daniel wasn't much of a talker. Clara noticed that quickly, but silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt calm. After a few minutes Daniel stood up and grabbed his hat. "I need to check the cattle," he said. "You can rest today." Clara shook her head. I'd rather help. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You ever worked on a ranch before? No. You know how to ride a horse? No. Milk a cow? Clara hesitated. Number. Daniel couldn't help but chuckle. Well then, we've got a lot to teach you. For the first time since arriving in Red Creek, Clara laughed. It felt strange but good. The days that followed were harder than Clara ever imagined. Ranch life was not gentle. The sun rose early, the work never ended, and the wind never seemed to stop blowing across the endless plains. Daniel showed her how to collect eggs from the chickens. The first time she tried, one of the hens chased her across the yard. Daniel laughed so hard he nearly fell over. You're doing great, he said through his laughter. Clara crossed her arms. You're enjoying this too much. But slowly, she began to learn. She learned how to cook over the iron stove. She learned how to feed the horses. And after several embarrassing attempts, she finally learned how to ride. The first ride didn't go well. Her horse trotted suddenly and Clara screamed as she nearly fell off. Daniel caught the reins just in time. Easy, he said calmly. The horse can smell fear. Clara glared at the animal. Well, I can smell stubborn. Daniel smiled. Something about Clara's determination impressed him. Most people would have left already. But she stayed, day after day, working hard, never complaining. One evening they sat outside watching the sunset. The sky burned with deep red colors across the horizon. Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Why did you help me? She suddenly asked. Daniel stared out at the prairie. I didn't think you had anywhere else to go. That's true, Clara admitted. But most people wouldn't take in a stranger. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally he said quietly, someone once helped me when I needed it. Clara turned toward him. Who? Daniel hesitated. Then he looked down at his hands. My wife. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You were married. Daniel nodded slowly. Her name was Emily. His voice softened when he said the name. What happened to her? Clara asked gently. Daniel's jaw tightened. She died 3 years ago. The wind blew softly between them. Clara felt a sudden ache in her chest. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded but said nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara realized something important that night. Daniel Hayes wasn't just quiet. He was broken. Over the next few weeks, Clara noticed more things about him. He barely visited town. He avoided people. He worked long hours like a man trying to outrun his memories. But slowly, something began to change. The ranch felt different with Clara there. The house wasn't silent anymore. There was laughter, conversation, warm meals instead of cold leftovers. One night Clara baked bread for the first time. It came out slightly burned. Daniel took a bite anyway. It's good, he said. Clara squinted at him. You're lying. Daniel shrugged. I've eaten worse. Clara laughed again, and Daniel realized something strange. It was the first time he had laughed in years. But not everyone in Red Creek liked the idea of Clara living at the ranch. One afternoon Daniel rode into town for supplies. Inside the general store, 2 ranchers whispered loudly. Hayes brought himself a mail-order bride now. Funny. I thought he buried his wife. Daniel's eyes darkened. He slammed the coins onto the counter. Mind your business. The men laughed. But Daniel didn't stay. He rode home faster than usual. When he arrived, Clara was hanging laundry outside. She noticed his tense expression. Everything all right? Daniel forced a nod. Just town gossip. Clara understood immediately. They think something improper is happening. Daniel looked uncomfortable. They don't understand. Clara smiled softly. People rarely do. Then she said something that surprised him. If you want me to leave, I will. Daniel looked at her quickly. No. The word came out faster than he expected. Clara raised an eyebrow. Daniel cleared his throat. I mean, winter is coming. It's safer if you stay. But deep down he knew the truth. The ranch didn't feel empty anymore. And he wasn't ready to lose that. That night Clara stood outside staring at the stars. The sky was clearer than she had ever seen. Daniel stepped onto the porch beside her. You miss the city? He asked. Clara shook her head slowly. No. Even after what happened, she thought for a moment. Sometimes the worst journeys lead us to the right place. Daniel looked at her. The wind gently moved her hair across her face. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel Hayes felt something stir in his heart again. Something he thought had died with his wife. Hope. But neither of them knew yet that trouble was already riding toward the ranch. And it would test everything they were beginning to feel. Trouble rides into Red Creek. Life on Daniel Hayes' ranch slowly found a rhythm. The mornings started before sunrise. Daniel would saddle the horses while Clara prepared breakfast inside the small wooden kitchen. The smell of fresh bread and coffee often filled the house, something that hadn't happened in years before she arrived. For Daniel, the ranch no longer felt like a lonely place. And for Clara, it finally felt like somewhere she belonged. But peace on the frontier never lasted forever. One cold afternoon, Daniel rode into the town of Red Creek again. Winter supplies were needed: flour, salt, and tools for repairing fences. Clara insisted on coming with him. I should learn the town if I'm going to stay here, she said. Daniel hesitated. Red Creek wasn't always kind to strangers. But eventually he agreed. The wagon rolled slowly into the dusty main street of the small town. Wooden buildings lined the road: the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, and the small church at the far end. People stopped and stared. A woman riding beside Daniel Hayes was not something the town had seen before. Clara felt the eyes on her immediately. Whispers followed them as they walked into the general store. That must be the mail-order bride. Callahan's girl, ain't she? Looks like Hayes kept her. Clara pretended not to hear, but the words stung. Daniel noticed her shoulders tighten. He leaned closer and said quietly, "Don't mind them. I'm trying not to," she replied softly. Inside the store, the shopkeeper, Mr. Dalton, greeted Daniel with a nod. Hayes. Then he glanced at Clara. And who might this be? Clara Whitmore, Daniel answered simply. Mr. Dalton studied her for a moment. Well, Miss Whitmore, Red Creek can be a rough place sometimes. Clara gave a polite smile. I'm beginning to notice. Daniel finished gathering supplies, but as they stepped outside, another voice stopped them. Well now, look what we have here. A tall man in a black coat leaned against the hitching post near the saloon. His hat was pulled low over sharp eyes that carried a cold confidence. His name was Victor Kane. And everyone in Red Creek knew him. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, and he had a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. Victor's eyes moved slowly toward Clara. Well, Daniel Hayes, he said with a smirk. Didn't know you had company these days. Daniel's expression hardened. Not your concern. Victor stepped closer. studying Clara like she was something valuable at an auction. So this is the girl Callahan ran off and left behind. Clara felt uncomfortable under his stare. Victor tipped his hat slightly. Victor Kane, ma'am. Clara nodded politely but said nothing. Victor chuckled. You know, a woman like you shouldn't be wasting time on a dying ranch. Daniel stepped forward slightly. That's enough. Victor smiled wider. Oh, relax, Hayes. I'm just being friendly. But his eyes held no kindness. As Daniel helped Clara into the wagon, Victor called out one last thing. If you ever get tired of that broken-down ranch, my door's always open. Daniel didn't respond, but Clara noticed his hands tighten on the reins as they rode away. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Finally Clara spoke. Who is he? Daniel stared ahead at the road. Victor Kane. And he doesn't like you. Daniel shook his head. He doesn't like anyone who doesn't bend to him. What does he want? Daniel's voice lowered. Land. Clara looked around at the wide open prairie. But there's land everywhere. Yes, Daniel said, but he wants this land. Clara felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. Why? Daniel hesitated. There's water under this property. A natural spring. Clara suddenly understood. And he wants it. Daniel nodded. He's been trying to buy the ranch for 2 years. Why didn't you sell? Daniel glanced at the house appearing in the distance. Because this is the only home I have left. Clara looked at him quietly. And in that moment she realized something important. Daniel wasn't just protecting land. He was protecting memories. A few days later, trouble arrived. Late one evening, Daniel returned from the fields and found the ranch gate broken. Fresh horse tracks covered the dirt. Someone had been there. Clara stepped outside when she saw his worried expression. What happened? Daniel pointed to the gate. Someone rode through here. They both looked toward the barn. Daniel moved quickly, checking the horses and cattle. Nothing had been stolen, but something felt wrong. Then Clara noticed something nailed to the barn door. A piece of paper. Daniel pulled it down and read it. His jaw tightened immediately. What does it say? Clara asked. Daniel handed it to her. The message was short. Last chance. Sell the ranch. VK. Clara felt her stomach twist. He's threatening you. Daniel folded the paper slowly. He's trying to scare me. Is it working? Daniel looked out across the dark fields. No. But Clara could see something else in his eyes. Concern. Victor Kane wasn't the type of man who made empty threats. That night a storm rolled across the plains. Thunder echoed across the valley as rain pounded against the roof. Clara couldn't sleep. She walked quietly into the kitchen and found Daniel sitting at the table, staring into the darkness. You should get some rest, she said. Daniel shook his head. Just thinking. About Kane. Daniel nodded. Clara sat down across from him. Maybe you should talk to the sheriff. Daniel gave a small, bitter smile. Kane practically owns the sheriff. Clara sighed. Then what are we going to do? Daniel looked at her. The lantern light flickered across his face. We keep going. That's it. That's the only choice we have. Clara studied him for a moment. You're stubborn. Daniel smirked slightly. I've been called worse. Clara smiled faintly, but deep down she felt uneasy. Victor Kane was not finished with them. Not even close. And before winter arrived, their quiet ranch would face a danger neither of them expected. The night everything changed. Winter was creeping closer to Red Creek. The wind grew colder every day, and the wide prairie fields slowly turned pale under the fading autumn sun. At Daniel Hayes' ranch, work had become harder, but Clara had grown stronger. She was no longer the frightened woman who stepped off the train weeks ago. Now she could ride a horse without falling. She could help repair fences. She could even help Daniel move cattle across the fields. But despite the peaceful routine, a shadow still hung over the ranch. Victor Kane. Since the threatening note appeared on the barn door, Daniel had been more alert than ever. Every strange noise in the night made him reach for his rifle. Clara noticed it. "You don't sleep much anymore," she said one evening while they sat near the fireplace. Daniel stared at the flames. "Just being careful." Clara sighed softly. "You shouldn't have to live like this." Daniel shrugged. "That's life on the frontier." But Clara knew it wasn't just the frontier. It was Victor Kane. One evening Daniel rode into town again to pick up supplies. Clara stayed behind at the ranch. The sky had already begun to darken when she finished feeding the chickens. The wind had picked up again, rustling the dry grass around the house. Something about the air felt wrong. Clara stepped onto the porch and looked across the fields. Then she saw it, 3 riders approaching in the distance. Her heart skipped. They weren't moving like travelers. They were moving like men with a purpose. Clara quickly stepped back inside and locked the door. Her hands trembled as she peered through the window. The riders stopped near the barn. One of them dismounted. Even from a distance she recognized the tall black coat. Victor Kane. Clara's stomach tightened. Victor walked slowly toward the house like he had all the time in the world. A heavy knock echoed on the door. Clara didn't answer. Another knock. Harder this time. "Miss Whitmore," Victor called calmly. "I know you're in there." Clara stayed silent. Victor sighed dramatically. "You really shouldn't make this difficult." Clara finally spoke through the door. "Daniel isn't here." "I know," Victor replied. "That's why I came." Clara felt fear creep through her chest. "What do you want?" Victor's voice grew colder. "I want this ranch. And Daniel isn't selling." Victor chuckled. "Daniel Hayes doesn't understand how the world works." Clara gathered her courage. "And what does that have to do with me?" Victor leaned against the door frame. "You're the only thing on that ranch he cares about." Clara froze. Victor continued softly. "If you leave, he might reconsider selling." Clara clenched her fists. "I'm not leaving." Victor's tone darkened. "That's unfortunate." He turned to his men. "Start with the barn." Clara's eyes widened. Through the window she saw one of the riders pull out a torch. "No!" she shouted, throwing the door open. Victor looked at her with calm satisfaction. "There she is." Clara stepped outside despite the fear shaking her legs. "You can't do this." Victor's expression remained cold. "I can do whatever I want." The torch moved closer to the barn. Clara's heart pounded. Then suddenly, a gunshot exploded across the field. The torch dropped into the dirt. Victor's men turned quickly. Daniel Hayes rode into the yard at full speed, rifle in hand. His eyes burned with anger. "Step away from my barn," he shouted. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Well, looks like the rancher's home." Daniel dismounted slowly, keeping the rifle aimed. "You're trespassing." Victor brushed dust from his coat. "I was just having a conversation with Miss Whitmore." Daniel stepped closer. "Leave." Victor studied him for a moment. Then he smirked. "You're fighting a losing battle, Hayes." Daniel didn't lower the rifle. Victor nodded to his men. "Let's go." The riders mounted their horses and disappeared into the darkness. But as Victor rode away, he called out one last warning. "This isn't over." Silence returned to the ranch. Clara's legs felt weak as Daniel walked toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I was scared." Daniel looked toward the road where Victor disappeared. "I should have been here." Clara shook her head. "You couldn't have known." Daniel sighed deeply. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara suddenly hugged him. It happened so quickly Daniel froze in surprise. Her voice trembled against his shoulder. "I thought something terrible was going to happen." Daniel hesitated, then slowly wrapped his arms around her. "It's all right," he whispered. But deep down he knew something. Victor Kane wasn't finished. Not even close. Later that night they sat inside near the fire. Clara stared at the flames. "He threatened to burn the barn," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That sounds like him. Why is he so determined?" Daniel leaned back in the chair. "Because men like Victor Kane don't accept defeat." Clara looked at him carefully. "And what about you?" Daniel met her eyes. "I don't give up either." For a moment the room fell silent again. Then Clara said something unexpected. "I'm not leaving." Daniel frowned slightly. "You should." Clara shook her head firmly. "No, Clara. I came west alone. I was abandoned before I even arrived." Her voice softened. "But this ranch, this place, feels like home now." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Clara looked at him gently. "And you're not fighting this alone anymore." Daniel didn't know what to say. For years he had carried everything by himself. The grief, the loneliness, the memories. But now someone stood beside him. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. And that realization scared him almost as much as Victor Kane. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie. The storm of trouble was only beginning. Because Victor Kane was already planning his next move. And the next time he came to the ranch, he wouldn't come with just 3 men. He would come ready for war. Love worth fighting for. The cold winds of early winter swept across the valley of Red Creek. At Daniel Hayes' ranch, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. After Victor Kane's visit, every day felt like the calm before a storm. Daniel repaired fences and checked the barn constantly. His rifle was never far from reach. Clara noticed everything. "You're preparing for a fight," she said one morning while handing him a cup of coffee. Daniel didn't deny it. Victor Kane doesn't make empty threats. Clara looked out toward the wide-open fields. "Do you think he'll come back?" Daniel's voice was quiet but certain. "Yes." 3 days later, he did. It happened just before sunset. Clara was inside the house preparing dinner when she heard the distant sound of horses. Not one horse. Many. Her heart dropped. She rushed to the window and felt her stomach twist in fear. 6 riders were approaching the ranch. And at the front of them rode Victor Kane. "Daniel!" Clara shouted. Daniel stepped out of the barn immediately, already sensing trouble. When he saw the riders, his expression hardened. "This ends tonight," he muttered. Clara stepped beside him. "What are we going to do?" Daniel loaded his rifle calmly. "We stand our ground." The riders stopped just outside the ranch gate. Victor Kane dismounted slowly, dusting his coat like he was arriving for a casual visit. "Well, Hayes," he called out loudly. "I'm tired of waiting." Daniel stood in front of the house. "You're not getting this ranch." Victor smiled coldly. "Oh, I am." He glanced toward Clara. And you're going to help me convince him. Before Daniel could react, two of Victor's men rode forward quickly and grabbed Clara. Daniel, she cried. Daniel's heart slammed against his chest. Let her go, he shouted, raising the rifle. Victor held up a hand. Careful, one wrong move and Clara could be hurt. Victor stepped closer, his voice calm and cruel. Here's how this works. He tossed a folded paper onto the ground. A property contract. Daniel didn't move. Sign it, and she walks away safe. Clara struggled against the men holding her. Don't do it, Daniel. Victor sighed. You see the problem here. She cares more about you than you care about her. Daniel's jaw tightened. Clara shouted again. This ranch means everything to you. Daniel looked at her. The truth was, she was wrong. The ranch used to mean everything. But things had changed. Victor noticed the hesitation. Tick-tock, haze. The wind howled across the empty fields. Daniel slowly lowered his rifle. Then he stepped forward. Let her go first. Victor laughed. You think I'm stupid? Daniel's voice became firm. You hurt her, and you'll never get that signature. Victor studied him for a moment. Then he nodded to his men. They released Clara. She ran toward Daniel immediately. The moment she reached him, Victor tossed the pen toward his feet. Sign it. Daniel looked down at the paper. Then he looked back at Clara. Her eyes were filled with tears. You don't have to do this, she whispered. Daniel smiled softly. Yes, I do. He bent down and signed the contract. Victor's grin widened. Smart man. But as Victor reached down to grab the paper, Daniel moved. Faster than anyone expected. He kicked the dirt up into Victor's face and lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. Gunshots exploded across the yard. Chaos erupted. Daniel fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Clara ducked behind a wagon as the ranch suddenly became a battlefield. One of Victor's men raised a gun toward Daniel. But Clara grabbed a nearby shovel and struck the man across the arm. The gun dropped. Another shot rang out. Victor Kane tried to reach for his revolver. But Daniel slammed his fist into his jaw. Moments later the remaining riders fled. The fight was over. Victor Kane lay unconscious in the dirt. Later that night the sheriff finally arrived to take Victor away. Apparently Kane had been causing trouble across the entire county. With witnesses now willing to speak, his control over Red Creek was finished. As the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the road, silence returned to the ranch. The sky was filled with stars. Clara stood near the fence, staring out at the dark prairie. Daniel walked up beside her. You all right? He asked gently. Clara nodded. Then she looked at him. You gave up the ranch for me. Daniel shrugged slightly. It's just land. Clara shook her head. No, it wasn't. Daniel stared out across the fields. You know something strange. What? For 3 years, I thought my life was over. Clara's voice softened. After your wife died. Daniel nodded. I was just surviving. He looked at her. Then you stepped off that train. Clara smiled faintly. Abandoned. Daniel shook his head. Maybe. Then he said something that made her heart race. But I think fate had other plans. Clara's eyes filled with emotion. Daniel. He hesitated for a moment. Then finally said the words he had been afraid to say. I don't want you to leave. Clara laughed softly through her tears. I wasn't planning to. Daniel took her hand gently. For the first time in years, his heart felt whole again. Sometimes life didn't go the way people planned. Sometimes dreams fell apart, but sometimes, the road meant for someone else led you exactly where you were meant to be. Under the quiet stars of the western sky, the abandoned bride and the broken cowboy finally found something neither of them expected. A new beginning. Together. Please friends spot my channel, subscribe, comment, like, share. Thanks for watching.